Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The South Carolina sun hadn't cleared the pines when Sarah Mitchell unlocked the Armory Bay at Fort Jackson. She kept her rhythm tight, badge, bolt, lights, inventory. Everything in its place, everything angled toward the exit, a habit that never left her bones. She wore the same loose gray work shirt every day, sleeves pushed to her forearms, knuckles nicked and healed and nicked again. The bench was already laid out the way she liked, drivers, punches, carbon scraper, torque wrench, spaced in a pattern no one else understood. Order was the only quiet she trusted. The range woke slowly beyond the rolling door. A truck coughed. Metal clanged. Somewhere a young sergeant laughed too loud, the way men laugh when they don't know they're being measured. Sarah tilted an upper receiver, listened to the rattle the buffer shouldn't make, and filed the sound away. She didn't waste words. She let skill speak, one weapon at a time, the way a medic learns a pulse with the same fingers every morning. Captain Richard Coleman swept through after 7:65, spine straight as a cleaning rod, voice that could strip paint. His shadow paused at her bench just long enough. Deadlines, Mitchell. Not 13:59, not 14:01, 1400 on the dot. He never waited for replies. He left challenge in the air like cordite. She answered the only way she ever did, by working faster without looking rushed. Sergeant David Miller watched from the catwalk with a clipboard he didn't need. Combat years had put a scar under his jaw that pulled when he frowned. He tracked the way Sarah held tools, how she braced a receiver with the meat of her palm instead of chasing it with a vise. Not curiosity about a woman in a shop, curiosity about a professional hiding in plain sight. He didn't say it. He just kept watching. Frank Howard arrived late, as always, coffee in a dented thermos, grease in the lines of his hands that had outlived 3 wars. He didn't fuss at her bench. He just gave the smallest nod a man gives another when words would tip a boat. Coleman's got brass visiting next week, he muttered later, under the hum of the ultrasonic tank. He's wound tight. Don't stand where the shrapnel lands. She answered with a soft copy, the syllable flat enough to vanish. By noon, the heat came up off the concrete like a warning. Sarah logged serials, signed out parts, corrected a spec that was wrong in the manual because manuals are written by people who don't have to carry the result. She liked the weight of solved problems. She liked the click that meant a bolt was true, the smooth run of a carrier that would not betray a kid at the worst possible second. She didn't like being seen. Coleman made sure she was. A tour of lieutenants bled into the shop just before lunch. He gestured wide, voice pitched for audience. This is where standards used to mean something. He let the line hang by her shoulder, then moved on. The lieutenants glanced back, embarrassed by nothing they could fix. Sarah kept her eyes on the task, and the rifle in her hands gave up its secret with a sound she knew like breath. The day finished the way it always did, solvent, rags, numbers. She locked the bay at 17:30 and drove the same nondescript sedan down the same 2-lane into Columbia where her apartment sat over a quiet laundromat. 1 plate, 1 mug, 1 fork. A bed made tight enough to bounce a coin and no one to throw it. The fridge held protein and eggs. The closet held duplicates. The life was smaller than the past on purpose. At 2000 she ran. 3 miles, Columbia's air thick enough to drink. Past storefronts gone dark, across a bridge where the river talked if you let it, back along a fence line that made sense because fences do. Mile 1 for a name she didn't say. Mile 2 for another. Mile 3 for the last. The cadence wrote itself on her lungs until the ache felt like permission to sleep. Sleep came like it always did, late, then hard. It brought the same mountain in a country she would never visit again, the same wind that tasted like metal, the same radio that crackled with a voice that stopped. She woke at 0303 because she always woke at 0303. She sat up slow, feet on cool floor, hands steady even when her chest wasn't. The locked box under the bed stayed where it was. She didn't need to open it to know what lived inside. Morning reset the clock. Her route to base took 10 minutes if the lights broke right, 12 if they didn't. The gate guard recognized her by silence. Inside, the world was bolts and deadlines and a calendar that pointed to nothing. But the surface was starting to ripple. Frank's glance lingered longer. Miller's questions came in careful shapes. And Coleman's attention sharpened, not the way a manager checks a schedule, but the way a hunter sights something he finally decided might be worth the bullet. At 0855 a new assignment sheet slid across her bench with a penciled note that wasn't regulation. Range Charlie. Bring tools. Not standard for a repair tech. Not subtle. She folded the paper once, slipped it in her pocket, and finished the weapon in her hands because unfinished work is how you lose leverage later. Then she stood, cleaned her station the way she always did, and walked out into a heat that smelled like dust and burned powder and the beginning of a storm. Beyond the berms, Range Charlie waited with its steel silhouettes and its long, flat wind. The crowd waiting there told a story: Coleman, a ring of junior officers, a few instructors leaning into curiosity like shade. Sarah took in the angles, the exits, the slant of the sun. She could feel it before she saw it, something more than a maintenance call, something designed. The bench at center held in State Route 25 that hadn't been loved in a long time. Bad storage. Or intentional. She didn't drop her eyes. She slowed her breathing, counted heartbeats, let the noise slide sideways until only the work remained. Whatever this was, it would be handled at the level she handled everything, quietly, precisely, without giving a single ounce more than the job required. Far away, a helicopter passed. She didn't flinch. She only shifted her stance, weight lower, elbows loose, so no one would see the moment the ground beneath her life began to tilt. Coleman let the silence gather like a crowd, then nodded toward the State Route 25 as if unveiling a monument. The rifle lay wrong, film of neglect on the rail screws, a hairline shine at the gas block where a wrench had kissed it too hard, faint grit in the trigger well that didn't belong to this range. Set pieces don't breathe, she thought. This one breathed like a trap. Show these officers what competent looks like, Mitchell, Coleman said, voice easy for the audience. Sarah answered by not answering. Gloves stayed pocketed. Skin told more truth. She eased the charging handle, felt resistance that didn't match carbon alone, listened to the bolt try to lie and fail. The buffer spring sang a note half a semitone flat. She pulled the upper, inspected gas tube alignment, traced the path of a man who'd bent it 3 degrees off true and thought no one would notice. Miller had moved closer, not enough to break rank, enough to see her hands. The lieutenants shifted like students waiting for a bell. Frank posted up at the edge of the group, eyes narrowed, mug forgotten. Sarah broke the rifle down just far enough, scoring in the chamber that shouldn't be there, lugs with where that didn't match round count, a scope mount stress fractured near the front ring like someone had torqued it for show. Deliberate. Sloppy only to a layman. Diagnosis, Ms. Mitchell. Coleman prodded, his mouth almost smiling. Bent gas tube, fouled port pattern, overcompressed spring, cracked mount, grit in the trigger, she said, plain as weather. This gun was prepared to fail. The ring of junior officers went still. Coleman's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. Prepared, or neglected, he asked, faux innocent. Neglect doesn't put sand where there's no sand, she said. Then she shut up. She didn't add that whoever prepped it had hands like an admin and a grudge like a cadet. She reassembled the rifle, corrected the bend with the gentleness of someone who knew what metal remembers, swapped the spring, cleaned the channel quick, retorqued the mount to numbers that live in muscle memory. 3 minutes. She shouldered the gun, ran the action. Smooth. Good now. Coleman looked past her to the officers. Take note. Even a broken clock gets lucky. The cheap line floated, then sank under its own weight. Miller's jaw ticked. Frank's stare said stop. Targets at 600 glinted in the heat. Sarah stepped to the line without permission, breathed in, let the rifle settle into that old pocket she pretended she didn't have anymore. Wind, a right-to-left whisper through the pines. Mirage, light but rising. 4 clicks. She pressed. The steel way out there rang a clean bell you feel in your teeth. Second shot, third, 3 notes in a row that made the crowd forget to shuffle. She cleared the weapon, safed it, laid it down like a sleeping dog. Coleman didn't clap. He didn't have to. The show was never really about whether she could do the job. It was about what she would do when pushed. He leaned in close enough for only her. Experience doesn't absolve, he said, voice gone private. It explains. Then, louder, to the circle, back to work. They dispersed with the awkwardness of people leaving a scene they cannot categorize. Miller drifted to her lane, kept his eyes on the targets. Range report later, he said, which meant I saw what I needed. Frank waited until the last shadow moved off, then set his mug on the bench. They'll keep pushing, he said softly. Make sure the push doesn't find a cliff. Sarah logged the State Route 25 as repaired and never wrote why. Paper is a net. People pull it when they're drowning. The day wore on with the brittle quiet of an aftershock. Coleman's footsteps passed her bench twice, 3 times, measuring. By 1700 she'd finished more rifles than assigned, left the shop as the sun was dropping into gold. Columbia took her back like it always did, strip malls, slow lights, a sky wide enough to swallow thought. She didn't run that night. She sat with a glass of water and listened to the hum in the drywall, the cheap AC fighting heat, the distant bass of a car at a red light that never turned green in time. At 1958 her phone lit with a name she didn't have. Unknown numbers don't belong in the front of the mind, so she let it die. At 2000, Frank's text arrived, Legion Hall, 2000 hours, if you want quiet with people who understand. She stood. The box under the bed stayed shut. She didn't need reminders to walk into a room full of ghosts. The American Legion Hall smelled like old varnish, coffee burned an hour too long, and 100 stories that never got told out loud. Men sat in a loose circle that wasn't a circle, no backs to doors, sightlines clean, a habit you don't shake. Frank tipped his chin to an empty chair. Sarah sat, shoulders squared, hands open on her knees. They didn't ask. They observed. The oldest of them, broad swimmer's shoulders gone soft with time, spoke first. You fix rifles like you've carried them. Not accusation, recognition. Good training, she said. Good training puts sand where there's sand, he said. No smile, no edge. Just a truth tossed into the middle like a coin. Frank broke the quiet. Word is, a colonel from D.C. was impressed yesterday. Word is, Coleman isn't. Laughter that wasn't laughter moved around the room. Sarah let it pass. She didn't owe anyone her history. She owed the next kid a rifle that wouldn't quit. A woman entered, late, hair iron gray, suit that fit like a decision. She moved like someone who had been saluted enough to forget the first time. Mitchell, she said, stopping at the edge of their knot circle. Colonel Margaret Hayes. I don't do surprises either, but here we are. We should talk. The room breathed in. Frank watched Sarah, Sarah watched the exits. Hayes didn't bother with small talk. Your skills are wasted where you are. And you're being targeted. Those two facts are connected. By who? Sarah asked, Because sometimes the shortest bridge is the only one that holds. By men who prefer expendable variables, Hayes said. And by one who's grieving himself blind. Coleman without the name, but the shape fit. Hayes lowered her voice. There's a pattern above your pay grade. Financial. Operational. Atlanta. Sarah didn't move, but the floor did, just a little. Patterns live in her head like maps. Financial means paper trails that burn without smoke. Operational means bodies on the line who don't get to choose the math. Atlanta means a tower of glass and the kind of security that thinks it knows what to look for. Why me? She asked. Because you already know how to see what others miss, Hayes said. And because the clock is loud. You felt it today. Frank's hand found his mug. Miller's name buzzed her phone with a single line, be careful. She pocketed it without reply. Hayes set a card on the table, no rank, no title, just a number. If you want this to stop happening to people who can't fight back, call before 0900. If you don't, they'll still come. Your choice is whether you meet them standing. Outside, the night smelled like rain that wouldn't fall. Sarah drove home with the windows down to let the air move through. The box under the bed slid open for the first time in months. Metal flashed, dull with use, bright with memory. 3 brass casings, a knife, a patch that didn't belong to this base, a token that said once and never again. She didn't pick anything up. She just looked long enough to remember why routine matters. The phone vibrated on the mattress. Unknown again. She let it ring to the end. Then she typed the number from Hayes's card into a message she would not send yet and set an alarm for 0430. Morning would come either way. But now there was a word in her chest she hadn't allowed in a long time, Atlanta. And behind it, another she tried not to think, ambush. Atlanta meant planning, and ambush meant the plan had to breathe. At 0430, Sarah was on the floor with a legal pad and a stubby pencil, drawing routes and redundancies the way other people draw hope. Lanes in, lanes out. Public entrances to Atlanta Financial Tower, freight corridors, maintenance shafts, badge points, elevator logic. She mapped the wind around a building of glass that thought it was a fortress and treated it like terrain. By 0600 she'd showered, tied her hair back, and chosen a suit jacket that erased edges without erasing intent. A ghost in business casual. Hayes returned her message with coordinates and a time. Keaton met her in a parking structure that smelled like warm concrete and spilled oil. He had the careful calm of a man who counts seconds for a living. Routine compliance audit as cover, he said as they walked, the sentence stripped for parts. Paperwork will open a door. You get what we can't request. We never met. He handed over a thin folder, a laminate badge that would pass a glance, and a look that admitted the risk was personal even if the language pretended it wasn't. At Midtown, the tower climbed into a sky already boiling to white. Inside, the lobby pretended to be a hotel, stone, plants, water that spoke softly. The desk didn't blink when she said, audit, because real power never blinks in public. She signed the book with a hand that didn't shake, rode an elevator alone, watched floors count by like a heart that knows better than to speed up. 14. Doors opened. Carpet swallowed footsteps. Cameras watched for things that moved wrong. Sarah learned long ago to move like furniture. The receptionist smiled a question she already regretted asking. Compliance review, Sarah said, sliding the letterhead that Hayes had manufactured out of air. The girl nodded and surrendered a small conference room with a wide monitor and too much daylight. An intern brought water that tasted like the filter had a conscience. Sarah logged into a guest machine and didn't push yet. Instead, she unpacked tools that wore the clothing of ordinary, dongles and adapters, cables and a pen that wasn't a pen. The building's network breathed through her fingertips, a slow animal at first, then faster as it realized it had an audience. Patterns talk if you let them. The foundation account moved money on a schedule that didn't care about holidays. Transfers to shells that owned shells that fed a contractor with a clean name and a dirty appetite. Sentinel by any other label. Amounts that matched estimates for deniable assets, a term that sounds tidy until you attach it to a person's bones. She copied quietly, split archives into fragments that wouldn't look like theft until they sat together again. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket with a vibration pattern she hadn't felt in years. Not Hayes. Not Keaton. A different frequency, buried muscle memory unrolling like a flag. She didn't check, just kept moving. The building's security cadence shifted on the periphery, hallway patrol a minute earlier than the posted chart, elevator stopping 2 unplanned times on this floor, the microscope sense operators get when eyes land where they shouldn't. Ambush. The word sat down beside her. She shut down everything that looked like offense and turned the room back into what it was supposed to be, a place where a woman in a blazer reviews ledger she isn't paid enough to understand. The door cracked, a man in a safe suit asked if she needed anything. A copy of your vendor list, she said, bored. The man retreated, bored too. The cameras kept their gaze. Files finished bleeding. The pen that wasn't clicked once, packet split, mirrored to a drive the size of a thumbnail that slid under a post-it in her notebook. She closed tabs like finishing prayers and left only a spreadsheet of shipping invoices on the screen. She waited exactly 90 seconds, the time it takes for a building to believe in itself again, and walked out. The hallway had grown a new pair of men who didn't know how to fake civilian posture. One adjusted his cuff and flashed a hard-knuckle scar no boardroom gift bag ever gave. They didn't look at her. Professionals don't. They looked past her, at the camera, at the elevators, at the clock invisibly ticking toward something. She turned left instead of right, bathroom detour, mirror check that wasn't about hair. Stall 2 carried a hatch behind a plastic panel labeled air freshener. It opened with a coin and a lie. Service space beyond smelled like dust and old air. She slid inside, let the panel fall, breathed shallow. In the duct, her phone buzzed again. She let it. On the other side of the wall, shoes passed with a rhythm that said, trained. She counted 4 bodies by weight and cadence. She weighted them out, then moved low along the service route to a ladder she'd memorized from a schematic that had never been meant for guests. Down 1 level, across a crawl framed by cable trays, up into a maintenance closet where mop water disguised a second door. The door knew a badge she didn't have, but the latch knew pressure, and steel always believes a certain kind of persuasion. It yielded. She stepped into a quieter corridor that looked legal on paper and invisible in practice. Outside, the heat wrapped her like a warning she'd already heard. She crossed to a garage where a sedan waited that wasn't hers. The driver didn't look back. South ramp, he said. Keaton's voice lived in the car audio, compressed, distant. We're not the only ones interested. You have what you came for. She said yes without telling him how much. Then ghost, he said, and cut the line. She ghosted. Midtown slid past in glass and shade. In the rearview, 2 vehicles took an interest, then reconsidered when the sedan did things that felt unwise and were. At an industrial edge where the city loses patience and becomes warehouses, they peeled off. The driver left her at a loading dock with a roll-up door that blinked twice like an eyelid. Inside, a room with no windows, 3 work tables, a smell of solder and coffee. And a man who should have been a headstone. He looked older at the corners and younger in the eyes, scar on the cheek that hadn't been there the last time a radio screamed both their names. He lifted a hand half a degree, like you do when you mean to salute and remember you don't wear it anymore. Chief, he said, voice like gravel and home. She didn't step forward. She didn't step back. Her chest didn't know which. Michael, she said, and the room changed temperature. Ramirez didn't hug. Operators who have played dead for long years learn to keep space as armor. He gestured to a table where a map of lines and money and names waited like a confession. You found the financials, he said. Good. We'll need them before the next team launches. Next team, she repeated, unwilling to let the words soften. He nodded. For kids with records that make them expendable on a spreadsheet. They go wheels up in days if we don't cut the wire. She set the thumbnail drive down like a small, heavy truth. He slid a folder toward her. Inside, photos of the tower she'd just walked through, faces of men who had pretended to be furniture and failed, a memo with a watermark from a foundation that washed blood with charity. At the bottom, a thin sheet with an old name she had buried under routine, Phoenix Dawn. Seeing it written felt like finding a boot print where only ghosts should walk. Keaton, she asked. Hayes. Ramirez's mouth pulled. On our side until they're not allowed to be. Phones or ears. We talk here. He tapped the map. We deliver to a channel Palmer can't seal with classification. Press with teeth. And we keep Team Alpha on the ground long enough for daylight to matter. She watched his hands move. The old choreography lived there, brief, precise, no wasted motion. It made her think of a second voice that used to answer his in dark rooms. She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. Ramirez saw it cross her face anyway. He's not a ghost, Michael said quietly. Not the way you think. The air bent. For a second she saw a mountainside that never stopped tilting. Thomas, she said, and the syllable landed like a dropped round in a silent room. Later, Ramirez said, not unkind. First we keep 4 strangers alive. He pushed a hardened handset toward her and a schematic of comms towers that lace a base she hadn't stepped on in years. We'll use your old protocol. Backdoor frequency, operator to operator, no command ears. She nodded because saying yes out loud might break something. Work steadies blood. They built the message with nouns only operators hear correctly, equipment excuse, stand-down phrasing, the kind of warning that doesn't read like warning to anyone who hasn't worn a plate carrier long enough for the sweat to make a map. She rehearsed the timing against the rhythm of an airfield they hadn't yet reached. When the sun rolled toward evening, Ramirez showed her the last page of the plan. If this goes loud, he said, they'll come where you sleep. He didn't have to explain who they were. You still running 3 every night? She didn't answer. He smiled like a man remembering a mile that hurt. Good. Keep lacing them tight. On her way out, the city looked different, angles sharper, shadows closer. Her phone vibrated one more time with that old frequency and a text that didn't use words, only a call sign she'd sworn off and a location that didn't exist on civilian maps. She didn't reply. She memorized it. Back in Colombia, the laundromat hummed below like a ship's engine. She washed the day off in silence, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened the box. The brass didn't accuse. The knife didn't offer absolution. The patch lay where it always lay, weightless and heavy. She set the hardened handset beside it and killed the lights. Outside, someone's dog barked at a passing night. Inside, she arranged her breathing to the old count, 4 in, hold, 4 out, hold, until the room steadied. When sleep came, it brought an airfield and 4 figures lined up under a hot sun, and her voice in their ear telling them how to live long enough to see another. Dawn bit the edge of the airfield, heat rising off tarmac like a promise that would hurt to keep. Sarah sat in her car a mile beyond the perimeter fence, handset cupped, eyes on the flight line through a gap in palmetto and chain link. Team Alpha stood in the wash of a spinning prop, helmets tilted, packs square, the posture of kids who haven't learned yet that you can be brave and unlucky at the same time. She keyed the backdoor frequency exactly on the second. Alpha, check equipment code Echo 7. Repeat, Echo 7, she said, voice flat as a checklist. No rank. No names. She let the syllables carry the weight of a stop sign only certain ears could see. On the line, a corporal hesitated the way a body hesitates when instinct collides with orders, then turned to his TL. They broke open cases, found nothing wrong on paper, found just enough knot right in the pattern of their harness stitching to trigger the clause she'd buried in the message. The TL raised a hand. Wheels up slid 30 minutes. Command didn't like that. The tower frequency popped with a polite order that wasn't polite. Alpha, proceed to load. Sarah slid a second phrase through the seam. Echo 7 variance confirmed. Awaiting QA sign-off. It bought 5. She needed 10. Out on the apron, a logistics captain stalked toward the team like a man who'd been told to make a number happen. He didn't see the wind. He didn't smell the trap. Her phone lit with the old call sign again and the location that didn't exist. She didn't answer. The hand set in her palm carried Ramirez's breath more than his words. We're up on the press channel in 20, he said. Keaton is shoving the package through a cutout. Hayes has a senator ready to pretend courage. When daylight hits, Alpha doesn't fly. Hold them long enough for the noise to outrun the order. Copy, she said, and tasted sand that wasn't there. Base security shifted like chess when a player sneaks a second queen onto the board. A Humvee rolled the fence line. A pair of plain sedans took up positions that pretended to be random. Sarah slid out of her car and moved into the shadow of the maintenance road, body low, steps counting in fours, mind splitting the field into angles and cover. She wasn't going in. She was going to make going in unnecessary. She keyed the Alpha TL direct, the part of the protocol that would get her crucified if anyone in an office traced the math. Lieutenant, she said, no greeting. If a bird goes up with you on it before QA signs, you're flying into a comms blackout labeled routine maintenance. Your ISR is cut for weather. Your route was filed last night by a contractor not on your roster. If you obey the schedule, you obey a spreadsheet. If you obey the checklist, you obey survival. There was a quiet you could drop a war into. Then the LT answered, voice young but steady. Understood. He turned to the logistics captain and said the only sentence that shuts a runway. I am unfit to command this flight until QA resolves a variance. He took off his helmet and set it on the tarmac. The gesture was small and seismic. The tower erupted. Phones climbed ears. Somewhere behind glass, a colonel decided whether career or conscience weighed more. On another line, a different kind of colonel, Hayes, stepped in with jurisdiction like a blade. Stand down. Temporary grounding. Congressional inquiry pending. The phrase, congressional inquiry, traveled faster than fear. For a moment, it held. Then the other shoe landed. 2 SUVs cleared the service gate with polite violence, black paint that never sees dust, plates that don't mean anything. Men in suits with the posture of people who think rules are for rooms they don't enter. They moved in AV that crowded the air around Alpha. Sarah felt the shape of Phoenix Dawn in the geometry, pressure without fingerprints. She pivoted before they did, cut through scrub, hit the hinge in the fence where 1,000 maintenance boots had learned to cheat an extra minute. Inside the perimeter, the air tasted like JP-8 indecision. She kept to shadows, watched the lead suit flash a credential that bought obedience, watched the logistics captain fold. The V tightened. The LT put his helmet back on because even the right stand costs less when your head feels covered. Ghost, you're about to be flanked by process, Ramirez said softly in her ear. Press goes live in 2. We need a spark on the airfield. She didn't like sparks. Sparks make daylight. But sparks also make people look up. She slid behind a power cart and palmed the panel she knew would be mislabeled. The ground crews had their rituals. She'd studied them from a distance the way a locksmith studies a church door. She pulled a breaker 2 slots to the right, killed auxiliary to the bird warming on the line. The engine coughed and died with a sound that turns heads. Heads turned. Maintenance fault, someone shouted. Incorrect power feed. The suits had to stop pretending to be invisible to argue with physics. That was the room she needed. She keyed the tower on a channel she should not have known. Advise ground that the AUX fault matches Echo 7 variant signature base-wide. Recommend full stand-down pending safety review. The controller hesitated, then repeated it because controllers say what the checklist says when bad things rhyme. Across the apron, movement scraped the edge of her vision. A figure peeled off from the suits, not moving like them at all. Slower. Heavier in a way that wasn't about weight. The angle of the shoulders cracked something under her ribs. That gait lived in a mountain she refused to dream. He came closer, the scar at the hairline a line a different life had drawn. He stopped outside the shadow where she waited and let the silence put both their names on the table. "Chief," he said, voice lower than she remembered and exactly right. "I knew you'd be here." "Thomas," she said, and the world telescoped down to the space between two old ghosts. He lifted empty hands just enough to show they were empty. "They're using my clearance to force this launch," he said quietly. "I give an all clear, Alpha flies into a hole. I refuse, I disappear again and they push it through someone else by noon." "Then don't give them either," she said. "Give me 30 seconds. He nodded once, grief and pride sharing a face. "You have 20, he said, because jokes are how you breathe when the room is thin. Ramirez's voice braided into the air. "Press package live," he said. "Names, dates, fund flows. Screens are lighting. Hayes has the committee chair on camera. Keaton says base council just went pale. If a bird takes off now, it takes off into a scandal." The suits felt the shift before the sound reached them. Phones vibrated, thumbs flew, the geometry faltered. Sarah stepped into daylight because sometimes daylight is the only cover left. She didn't sprint. She walked like she belonged to gravity. Coleman's voice cracked across the field before she could speak, that old paint-stripping tone aimed in the right direction for once. "This airfield is under a safety stand-down by order of the Department of the Army," he barked, improvising the department part with the confidence of a man who understands that volume beats evidence for 30 seconds. "Anyone moving a troop beyond this line will answer to me and to DC." He saw her an instant later. The line of his jaw shifted, not to anger, recognition. He tracked to Thomas, tracked back to her, and put three truths together without blinking. Then he stepped in front of the suits because sometimes a man who has been wrong all his life earns the right to be right once. Hayes appeared with the sort of escort that makes rules suddenly visible. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. "Launch is cancelled," she said, crisp as paper, loud enough to carry. "Pending review of contractor interference and financial irregularities tied to the Phoenix Dawn Foundation." The name hit the air like a courtroom door closing. One of the suits tried to shoulder past. Military police arrived like a tide that had finally found a shore. Hands met wrists. The V broke. Phones filmed. The logistics captain took 3 small steps in the direction of survival. The LT of Alpha stood like a kid who had learned a new law of physics in public and was deciding to believe it. Thomas exhaled a breath he'd been holding for years. "They'll pivot," he said to Sarah, low. "Different runway, different team." "Let them try," she said. "Today we bought daylight." Coleman's eyes cut to her again. Up close, he looked older than his rank and younger than his grief. "I misjudged you," he said, the words like gravel he'd chosen to chew. "Explains a lot. Doesn't absolve a damn thing." He angled his chin toward the LT. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," she said. "Thank the checklist." Sirens in the distance swelled into presence, not emergency, attention. Camera crews rolled under escort, microphones like little white flags. Keaton appeared at Hayes' shoulder for half a second, then dissolved back into function. Ramirez's text hit her phone with 4 words, "You did what mattered." She should have felt relief. Instead she felt the second wave you learn to expect if you live long enough. Retaliation doesn't sleep. It reroutes. The men in suits weren't the only ones on the board. Somewhere above them, a different hand would move a different piece. Hayes met her gaze and nodded like two chess players acknowledging the clock. Security escorted the suits off the apron. Alpha stood down to a hangar that smelled like sweat and new paint. The bird cooled, metal ticking like a heartbeat learning a slower tempo. Sarah stepped back into the shadow of the maintenance road, lungs remembering how to count. Thomas matched her pace without touching her space. "You look the same when you're lying to yourself," he said softly, not unkind. She didn't answer. He didn't need one. "There's more coming," he added. "Palmer won't lose quietly." Atlanta was the head. "There's a hand in D.C. with reach." "Then we cut the wrist," she said. "Not with press alone," he said. "With proof a judge can't flinch from." Ramirez came up on the net again, his voice quieter now that noise was doing some of the work. "Local media is chewing. National is warming. We have 36 hours before the counternarrative lands. We need the internal memo that ties Phoenix Dawn's board to taskings. It's in D.C., and it's not in any system Hayes can subpoena without tripping alarms." Sarah looked at the airfield where a launch had become a lesson. She looked at Thomas, who had been dead long enough for ghosts to get used to him. She looked at the horizon, where the sky over South Carolina made a promise you can only keep by moving. "Then we go to Washington," she said. "Tonight," Thomas said. "Tonight," she agreed. The syllables felt like a door closing and another opening. They peeled back out through heat and chain link, past a Humvee that pretended not to see and a guard whose eyes were less suspicious than grateful. Coleman watched from the edge of the apron, hands behind his back like a man at a graveside who finally knew the name on the stone. He didn't call out. He didn't need to. His nod said he understood what had started. On the highway north, the road unspooled beneath their tires. The handset lay face down between them, silent for once. Columbia slid behind, then the long dark run toward a city that eats evidence and occasionally chokes on a bone. Sarah set her jaw to the rhythm of mile markers and the beat of an old count, 4 in, hold, 4 out, hold. The box under her bed was empty now except for what could not be carried. The rest of it was in the car, in the driver's seat, in the passenger who wasn't a ghost after all, and in the hour when a plan stops being lines on paper and becomes a life you either take back or lose for good. She chose to take it back. Washington rose ahead like a lit threat, lanes feeding a beltway that never sleeps and never forgives. Thomas drove like a man who could feel patterns in traffic. Sarah watched the mirrors and the clock. Hayes texted a time, Keaton a door, Ramirez a phrase that would open a room without a name. Proof a judge can't flinch from, that was the mission now, not drama, not heroics, paperwork with teeth. They staged in a parking garage 3 blocks from the river where concrete eats sound. Hayes stepped out of an unmarked sedan in a civilian coat that fit like authority. Keaton looked like he belonged in any building with a badge reader. The memo sits in a compartment on the 5th floor of a contractor annex, off the books, printed once a week and initialed by a deputy who thinks he's untouchable, Hayes said. Palmer uses it as a handshake between Phoenix Dawn's board and tasking. We can't subpoena what doesn't exist in the system. We can, however, walk it out. Cameras? Sarah asked. Plenty, Keaton said. But the maintenance loop runs 9 minutes at night for a system refresh. That's your window. 2 doors with PIN codes, 1 with biometrics. We have a code. We don't have the hand. Thomas flexed his right hand, the scar at the hairline its own small confession. He'll use mine if it gets us home, he said. No bravado. Just a ledger being balanced. Timing ruled them. They moved as the city exhaled after midnight, up a service elevator that pretended to be broken, along a corridor that smelled like old toner and stale coffee, into a mechanical room where a panel hid a badge reader with no brand. Keaton killed the loop on cue. Sarah slid them through the first door and listened to the building breathe. Second door, code. Third door, the hand. Thomas pressed his palm where a different man should have been. The censor hesitated, then accepted a lie told well. Inside, the compartment wasn't a safe with spinning dials. It was a mundane file drawer with a locking rail, the sort of banal evil that survives audits. Sarah pulled a folder stamped with a word that told you nothing, flipped to a memo with a watermark that told you everything. Signatures that married money to missions, line items that labeled teams like shipments. Phoenix Dawn in black and white. She scanned, imaged, and printed a clean copy because originals vanish, copies breed. Footsteps. Polite, measured, too quiet for janitorial. Sarah slid the drawer in, relocked, and tucked the memo against her spine. Thomas eased the door open a breath. Two men in suits waited at the far end of the corridor like punctuation. Palmer's kind. Keaton raised a hand for patience, then tossed a binder down the hall. It landed with bureaucratic thud. The men turned for the noise you can blame. Hayes led them the other way with an argument about after-hours access that only a colonel can win. 30 seconds bought, the kind you feel in your teeth. They retraced, hand, code, badge. The loop ended as their elevator closed. Cameras blinked awake like eyes pretending they hadn't been shut. On the street, night air tasted like wet stone. Hayes didn't smile until the car doors shut. Now we can make them choke, she said. Keaton gets it to an inspector general with spine. Ramirez feeds the press the existence. We deliver the document to a judge under seal before dawn. Before dawn, the memo sat in the hands of a federal magistrate who read fast and frowned slow. Keaton spoke in careful verbs. Hayes signed an affidavit with a pen that didn't shake. The judge looked at Sarah last. You understand the weight of what you're alleging, he said, not unkind. I understand the weight was already on people who couldn't carry it, she said. He nodded once, like a door closing. Warrants breed consequences. By afternoon, Phoenix Dawn trended for reasons it had never intended. Committee staffers called meetings they couldn't hide. The contractor annex found itself photographed from every legal angle. Palmer's name oiled into the lower thirds of channels that had only chatted around the edges. The counternarrative spun up, rogue elements, misunderstandings, a smear before the truth, but the memo cut through like a blade that doesn't care who's holding it. On base, Alpha stood down for good. The LT sent a message through the back door that wasn't a back door anymore. We owe someone we'll never name. Coleman forwarded it to no one, then walked to Sarah's bench at Fort Jackson without his entourage. He didn't apologize. He stood, hands behind his back, and let a man's face say what his mouth couldn't. There's a board of inquiry, he said instead. This time the board is looking up, not down. Frank brought coffee he didn't pretend tasted good. Press can't fix everything, he said. But sometimes it keeps the machine from chewing another leg. Sarah took the cup and let heat settle the shake she hadn't admitted. Ramirez disappeared like professionals do when noise attracts flies. He left a note taped under her workbench, a grid coordinate, a date, a simple sentence, debt paid forward. Thomas stayed visible just long enough to testify in a closed room with a recorder that clicked too loudly. On the curb afterward, he looked at Sarah the way a man looks at a shoreline after a long swim. We bought time, he said. Not peace. She nodded. Time is the only currency that ever mattered. Hayes weathered a storm of briefings and sharp questions with the patience of a woman who has buried more than one plan. They'll cut fingers to save the hand, she warned. Palmer will fall. Someone above him will try to rearrange the pieces and rename the board. But the kids aren't flying into a hole today, and that's not nothing. The ripples reached Columbia slowly, like mail. The laundromat hummed. The bed was still tight, the plate still single. But silence felt different. It wasn't a bunker now, it was a choice. Sarah ran at dusk and didn't count names for 3 miles. She counted breaths and thought of the LT setting his helmet on the tarmac because a stranger told him to trust the checklist. She thought of the judge's pen, the way it turned doubt into process. She thought of Frank's steady nod, Hayes's unblinking stare, Keaton's quiet competence, Ramirez's gravel laughter over a line that wasn't supposed to exist. News crawls softened from scandal to oversight to hearing scheduled. The machine chewed itself for a while, then spit out a report with redactions like shotgun pellets. It didn't fix everything. It fixed enough. The contractor's license was suspended pending criminal review. A tasking pipeline was rerouted under rules that had teeth if you chose to bite. Coleman sent 2 young officers to shadow Sarah for a week and learn the difference between specs and survival. One evening, the American Legion Hall opened its door to air and a small applause that made her want to turn around. She didn't. She stood in it and let it land, not as hero worship, most of them don't believe in that anymore, but as recognition that someone had held a line long enough for Dawn to get a head start. Hayes lifted a paper cup in a toast without a speech. Frank grunted something that meant more than words. Thomas slipped out early, a silhouette against a parking lot light, headed toward a life that might finally know his real name again. Later, in the quiet, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed with the box open. The brass casings looked smaller. The knife was still a knife. The patch would always be a promise and a warning. She placed the hardened handset on top, closed the lid, and slid it back. The apartment didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a staging area for something that didn't need to be defined to be real. She set an alarm for a reasonable hour and let sleep come without bargaining. Outside, Columbia breathed. Inside, the world finally felt like it could hold without her holding it up alone. Morning cracked over Columbia in quiet gold, painting the laundromat roof and the street below as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The noise in Washington had settled into hearings and subpoenas, the kind that grind slow but cut deep. Phoenix dawn was no longer a whisper. It was headlines, indictments, and shuttered offices. Palmer sat in custody, stripped of his suit armor, waiting for a trial that promised more than one skeleton to rattle loose. The machine hadn't stopped, but it had tripped, and sometimes that was enough to save lives. Sarah returned to Fort Jackson the same way she always did, badge, gate, bench. Routine stayed her anchor. Coleman stopped by once, not with officers, not with sarcasm, just to stand at her workbench long enough to say, "I'll sign off on anything you ask for." She didn't ask. She just kept fixing rifles because weapons still broke, and kids still needed them to work in places where nobody from Washington ever went. Frank wandered in with donuts that tasted like cardboard, and she ate one anyway. His grin creased the lines of a man who had carried too much but still chose to show up every morning. Miller came with questions more direct now, eyes sharper after seeing how close the airfield came to becoming a graveyard. "How did you know to stop them?" he asked once. Sarah didn't answer directly. She simply tapped a checklist pinned to the wall and said, "Because the paper doesn't lie if you know how to read it." He nodded like a man who understood there was more but also understood boundaries. At night she ran the same 3 miles, but the count was different. No longer mile 1 for Thomas, mile 2 for Michael, mile 3 for Benjamin. They had their place in her memory, but the run became something else, a preparation, not penance. A rhythm that kept her body sharp and her mind quieter. Sometimes she imagined Ramirez pacing her in the shadows, gravel laugh still in her ear. Sometimes she imagined Thomas ahead of her, that scar catching the streetlight, leading towards something unspoken. She didn't chase. She didn't fall back. She simply ran with the knowledge that she wasn't carrying ghosts alone anymore. Hayes called twice, not for orders but for perspective. "We need instructors who can teach what can't be written down," she said. "I want you to consider it." Sarah listened, thanked her, and didn't commit. She wasn't ready to stand in front of rooms again, not yet. Hayes respected the pause. "You'll know when it's time," she said before hanging up. Keaton checked in once with a simple message, memo led to 3 convictions already. Still moving. Bureaucrats don't thank, but he didn't have to. The message itself was thanks. Weeks stretched into months. The American Legion Hall stayed open, its circle a little fuller now. Younger vets trickled in, drawn by whispers that someone there understood. Sarah sat with them sometimes, listening more than talking, watching the way shoulders dropped when recognition landed. She didn't tell her story. She didn't need to. Recognition lives in silence too. Thomas kept his distance, the way men do when their existence is half classified. But once, in Montana, she saw him. A safe house tucked into hills where air smelled clean and the sky was too wide to lie. Ramirez was there too, older in the eyes but lighter in the step. They didn't embrace. They didn't have to. A map lay on the table, dotted with marks that spelled out other Phoenix dawns waiting under different names. "We're not done," Thomas said. "But we're not alone either." Sarah traced one of the marks with a finger and nodded. That was enough. Back in Columbia, her apartment shifted. The box under the bed still lived there, but she opened it less. The brass shells dulled with time instead of her touch. The knife stayed sharp but unused. The patch remained a reminder, but no longer a weight. The hardened handset rested on top, powered down, waiting. Not a chain to the past anymore, but a tool if the future called. She could live with that balance. News cycles moved on. Washington found new scandals to chase. But the ripple remained. Oversight committees tightened teeth, budgets gained new scrutiny, contractors lost their easy shields. Alpha deployed months later into a different theater, this time with full support and eyes that knew someone had stood up for them. They came home alive. That was the only ledger Sarah cared to read. On a cool fall morning, she drove to a hillside outside Helena where stones marked names without bodies. 3 markers stood together, carved simple, clean. Thomas Anderson. Michael Ramirez. Benjamin Clark. She stood in front of them with Thomas beside her, very much alive, the irony of memorial stones not lost on either of them. Ramirez laughed softly. "Guess we're harder to bury than they thought." Sarah placed her hand on the cold stone anyway. "Some promises are to the living, some to the dead, some to both." She whispered a word no one else heard and let it go. The sun climbed higher, light spilling across the markers, across their faces, across the empty Montana hills. Sarah closed her eyes and breathed. No count this time. No ghosts. Just breath. Just now. Just the quiet possibility that maybe she wasn't only surviving anymore, maybe she was living. She opened her eyes, squared her shoulders, and walked back toward the waiting vehicle. There would always be another mission, another fight, another name to protect. But for the first time in 5 years, she believed she could face it not as a penance, but as a choice. And choice, she realized, was freedom.